Welcome to the Lead Well podcast. Today, we are going to dive into one of the biggest challenges I see facing leaders. And that is that the very behaviors that can make you effective as a leader are the same behaviors that can lead to burnout. If you think about it for a moment, when you move into a leadership role, you've generally got there based on your technical expertise. So you will have got that promotion based on delivering consistent high levels of performance. But when you move into that leadership role, the reality is your level of control starts to diminish. And what matters is your ability to influence those around you who most impact your success. And we generally refer to those influencing skills as soft skills. But as we know, they are not soft skills. In fact, they are going to dictate your success. And over the last decade, I've really been curious about understanding this dynamic. I reference this as the leadership paradox. And through various episodes of this podcast, through getting to work one-to-one with executives, and most recently, conducting research in this area, I've been able to uncover a set of skills which, if we can develop them early on in our leadership careers, we find ourselves more effective in our roles, higher performers, but also we are protecting our physical, mental, and emotional well-being. And one of the leadership styles which has been heavily researched is what we call transformational leadership. And in today's working world, we want our leaders to show up and be transformational. But what does that really mean? Well, it's categorized by what we call the 4 I's. So first of all, we have inspirational motivation. And when you think of that, I want you to think of the behaviors of a leader who's able to stand up in front of the group and be able to articulate their message with clarity. Second, we have intellectual stimulation. And this is the ability of the leader to be able to stretch the thinking of their teams. The third one is what we call idealized influence. And this is where we see the leader showing up as the role model with the right morals, ethics, behaviors. And as we know, for a leader, you're constantly under the spotlight. Your actions, interactions, and reactions are always being observed. And the final I is what we call individualized consideration. And this is the leader who's able to move that relationship with team members away from just being based on their output, but you're actually building a relationship with your team members which showcases a level of empathy, a level of care. And that's what's really going to get your team members to buy in to you as a leader. And I focused on that leadership style when doing research with CEOs and exploring their leadership journey. But as part of that research, I also looked at previous research that has been done in this area. And it's probably no surprise to you to learn that leaders who show up and showcase those transformational behaviors, they see increases in motivation, innovation, overall performance within their teams. And it really, over the years, we've seen tons of research back up that transformational leadership for followers is extremely beneficial. However, it's probably not surprising to see that where the research was lacking was the impact that those behaviors had on the leaders themselves. And of the research that had been done, what we saw was that this idea of constantly having to lean in to this relational nature of leadership, constantly being under this spotlight, well, it took its toll on leaders. It increased levels of emotional and cognitive load, and ultimately, in circumstances, could lead to burnout. So as I investigated this through the research, but also through my interviews with CEOs, what I found was that it was their inability to be able to deliver on certain skills, which was pushing them towards burnout. So first of all, they had to try to identify these skills as they moved through their journeys, but then they also had to try to develop those skills. So what I've done is I've extracted those specific skills. I've been able to extract those skills to essentially help emerging leaders, essentially skip the queue a little bit, develop these a little bit earlier on in your career. And the reality is, this is the real paradox with leadership. So as you're trying to develop these skills, as you're stepping into these one-to-one interactions, these group interactions, you're filled with overwhelm. You're filled with anxiety because deep down, you know that you haven't quite mastered those skills. And not only that, but as we know, these relationships, which are key, are always in flux. So if you step into a one-to-one interaction and you get that interaction wrong, well, that relationship all of a sudden begins to diminish. Or if you stand up in front of the group and you can't clearly articulate your message, that group all of a sudden are in their silos talking about, do we really buy into this leader's message? And you know this. And I suppose the compounding effect with this is your levels of stress begin to increase. Your well-being begins to suffer. And what you find is you have this seesaw where your demands are starting to increase, and all of a sudden your resources to deal with those demands start to diminish. But you'll be happy to know that there is an answer. As I say, I've identified specific skills that you can focus on. And in the next few episodes of these solo podcasts, I'm going to unpack these specific skills because I've developed a framework which on one side, you have what we call those transformational leadership skills. And on the other side, we have key well-being skills that when we get the balance right between both of these, we can be effective as a leader, but more importantly, our leadership in terms of high performance can be sustainable. I often like to go back to the Marshall Goldsmith quote that leadership is a contact sport, and it is relational in nature. But where do we play this sport? Well, it's really in three arenas. The first is what we might call your relationship with yourself, so self-leadership. And what I found through my research was an area that leaders struggled based on having to do the one-to-one interactions and the group interactions was their ability to strategically prioritize what was important. And that makes sense. If I'm putting a lot of my cognitive and emotional energy into keeping this team on side, well, then I'm essentially not using that in other key areas. The second arena is the one-to-one interactions. For example, think about having those performance conversations on a weekly basis. If I'm not skilled enough in those areas, it's easy to see how they could drain my overall energy, my ability to perform. And that final arena is group communication. Have you developed the storytelling skills to be able to stand in front of that group, engage them, and clearly define the message and the way forward? Because it's in these three arenas, really, where you will show up and be effective as a leader. Remember, your role as a leader is not to create more followers. Your role as a leader is to create more leaders. And that starts with developing these key skills. Over the next few episodes, we will dive deeper into these critical skills to help you continue to move along in your leadership journey. Thank you.